We've had preceptors that we've interviewed who were nominated by their the new graduates as saying, "She taught me so much. She was so helpful." And each one of them had a real spark, a real engagement with being a preceptor. And you think, oh, if only everyone were closer to that place. But in fact, a lot of nurses feel quite overloaded and even burned out. And they see precepting as an added burden to their work. What can we do to improve that situation? How do we work with preceptors? We can't do without them.
Yeah.
So how do we work with them and make it more feasible for them?
Yeah, that's a hard situation because we can't we can't do the work of clinical teaching without the clinical preceptors who are doing the work, and they're the ones who are the best situated to bring the new nurses along, obviously. And we can't sustain the practice without new nurses coming into the practice. So we all know that the clinical preceptor's role is essential to sustaining healthcare, basically healthcare delivery the way it's structured. So so we all want to do the work. I don't think there's anyone who thinks, oh, you know, we don't need to precept students. Nobody needs to precept students. Nobody's going to say that. But it's just when it comes to the point where you're never alone in your practice, you know, I mean, not alone, I don't mean alone, you know, isolated, but I mean, you're never practicing as a nurse without also practicing as a teacher. And this gets tiring, right? I mean, I remember as a nurse, I sometimes would want to do a shift where I could just make decisions without having to explain them or having to bring someone else along with me. I just want to do it myself. You know, it's kind of like, well, yeah. So just wanting to be engaged in your practice as a nurse without having to also be a teacher. And I can totally relate to that feeling. At the same time, the way healthcare is right now, and especially hospital-based practice, there's such turnover in staff, right? And for various reasons. You know, it's not necessarily the work environment is not good, so staff leave. It's that, you know, new graduates have all kinds of plans, and the plans change. You know, they're new to the practice, they want to stay here for, they think, their life, but then, you know, 2 years later, they're like, oh, wait, no, something else is interesting to me, I need to go. So the turnover, and the younger the staff, you know, the more turnover I think you're going to have. So being ready for that and being able to cope with that, because then you're going to have to bring new nurses into the environment, right? And it's this constant influx of new nurses and learners, right? You have student nurses on certain days of the week, you have new orientees on other days of the week, and the nurses are never able to just engage with their own practice. They're always having to teach others. So this gets very tiring. But so how can we develop systems that integrate learners at various stages into the delivery of healthcare? And this is something I think we haven't explored fully. There aren't really robust models for this. That kind of the legitimate peripheral participation that Lev and Wenger talk about, that having learners in the environment becomes just part of the environment. So there isn't an opportunity ever to be working as a nurse without also being in some capacity a teacher. And this is part of the role. It's part and parcel, right? And I'm not talking about necessarily orienting a new grad as the official preceptor. But for myself, if I'm an experienced nurse on the unit, I'm always a teacher for those who are less experienced. Maybe they're not on orientation anymore. Maybe they've been a nurse for a year, 2 years. But I've been a nurse for 5 years, and I've seen more situations. I'm always going to be in that teaching role in some capacity. So if we could somehow layer the learners, right? And we're all learners, you know.
But
even
what do you mean by layer the learners?
Yeah, that's a good question. What do I mean by that? Well, I guess what I mean is not having a whole huge influx of brand new learners who are completely fresh to the practice, but having those who are brand new, and then those who are 2 years in, a year or 2 years in, then those who are more experienced, but thinking of all of these nurses as learners. Not just these ones who are fresh coming in. These are the learners who are going to burden us with their needs. No, I'm a learner also, and so am I, and so am I. right? And then attending to the learning needs of all of these different layers, all of these different levels of learner, so that we get this into the culture that everybody's learning all the time and everybody's teaching all the time, right?
Right. And this really is the grand vision of the work of knowledge workers, of being a learning organization where you foster learning. You can't have reliability in a complex practice such as nursing or medicine without having this ongoing developing and passing along what's just been learned.
Yeah, and we talk about the lifelong learner, right, when we, in school, right? But there is this very important, I think, to recognize this distinction between sort of academic schooling that happens in school and academic settings and workplace learning, and the difference, how this new graduate nurse makes that transition into the workplace learning environment. And they're seen as, well, this is the learner. But if we could somehow integrate into our environments the fact that we're all learners, and there's just a different way of learning in this sort of environment.
Right. And we like to imagine that we can predict, that we can manage, that we can control. But we know in our fast-paced, very complex environments, we're going to be confronted with things we don't expect, things we've never encountered before. And so we have to be that open, responsive learner, being turned around, being changed by what we encounter.
Yeah. And to show that no matter how many years or how much experience I've had, as a nurse, I'm always a learner.
Right.
And so the new grad learner doesn't feel like I'm the only one and I'm the burden here. Right.
Right. That's such a good point. Okay. Well, onward. We have to figure out how to forge these learning organizations and learning professionals. Nurses don't often talk about their huge role in teaching the new resident or working on the healthcare team. Maybe it's with the respiratory therapist or the social worker. But there's so much teaching and learning that's going on across disciplines.
Right. Yeah, and how much nurses are learning from other disciplines,
Exactly.
other professions that, you go into the environment and you think, well, I'm the nurse, I'm training this new nurse, I'm the teacher, but then you find yourself the learner in another situation.
Right.
And asking for guidance. And,
Right.
Yeah.
We all need each other. We stand on each other's shoulders. And that's the only way, I think, to manage the knowledge work demands of healthcare.